Welcome back to the Secret Classroom here in the FreeMelon Society. I'm Eli Martyr, and we are going to pick up right where we left off from the last episode in this series and flesh out the rest of the story when it comes to environmentalism. In part 2A, we talked about environmentalism and its origins in its essence and its spirit, and where the impulse for environmentalism is coming from so that you can better understand and grasp the reasons why the environmental movement has been fleshed out in the way it has, and that will give you a more complete understanding of this whole subject. And in this part, we're going to jump into the offshoot of the environmental movement, which is the whole climate change agenda and demonizing CO2. If the environmental movement is going to be used as a weapon, right? We talked about this before. Then we need to find a specific enemy to focus the public attention on. What they settled on was the phenomena of changing climate and natural disasters as a result of human activity here on the planet. And we also are now demonizing CO2. Unbelievably, we are demonizing CO2, and the environmental movement is now trying to convince you, the public, that CO2 is a bad guy. Where environmentalism is going to rope in and tie in veganism into the picture is they will use veganism to sell the idea of waging war against that fictitious bad guy of CO2. So before we get there, let's continue to flesh out the myth of climate change and CO2, and we'll at least get that straight, and then we'll tackle the rest later. Is CO2 the enemy? Human-produced CO2, anthropogenic. Okay, when they say anthropogenic, that means man-sourced, man-derived. Anthropo means man, and genic means created. Okay, created by. Or origin, or the genesis, right? Creation, origin. So, origin in man. So, human-produced CO2, anthropogenic CO2, is the prime cause of a phenomenon called global warming. That is the lie. I figured we would just cut right to the chase and get right to the conclusion and give you the conclusion, and then we can flesh out why this conclusion is correct. So, that is the lie. Here's the truth of the matter. The truth is that human-produced CO2 has virtually nothing to do with the variable periods of warming and cooling that take place on planet Earth due to several infinitely more relevant factors, such as the sun, okay, obviously, but it's more than that. It's a lot of other things. So, that's the truth. Climate change due to man-made CO2 poisoning the atmosphere is the lie. And anyone in the vegan movement promulgating this lie, you are hurting the progress of human conscious evolution. You are helping to herd the human population over a cliff and to their demise. You may have good intentions, but the good intentions have not been marshaled by proper understanding first. And that's something that we need to correct. At this point, what we know is A, the enemy has determined that a bad guy, a quote-unquote bad guy, to war against is always necessary, and that traditional war is too destructive and overt. The enemy has designated environmental danger as the best enemy to fabricate in order to maintain a perpetual state of fear. Now, of course, if you are an evil bad guy from some fictitious movie, this is a really good approach to getting what you want done. Because yeah, traditional warfare is overt, it's loud, it's destructive, it's in your face. And that is effective, I guess, in one way, but if you really, really want to be truly effective, then what you'd want to do is you'd want to have your target population wage war on itself from the inside, from their own hearts, from their own minds. You'd want to instill into them and program into them snake-like, deceptive mental poisons that compel them to do things in your best interest. That is much more effective. This is so insidious. Since CO2 is a ubiquitous an indispensable element of life, it would mean that CO2's demonization would result in a never-ending eternal war impossible to win. You see how effective that is if your intention is to never allow a state of peace to overcome your population. you can see how effective this is. It's genius. Since CO2 is involved in virtually all processes necessary for life, eco-tyrannists would now have a justification to police, control, and tax anything that relates to life. Life, a byproduct of life itself, is carbon. We are carbon-based organisms. Life is carbon-based. So all processes that relate to life involve carbon and CO2, which means that if CO2 is your enemy, then now you have a justification to target all of life with your authoritative, restrictive laws and regulations and rules. It's genius. It's genius. And you fell for it, right? CO2 is the perfect villain. And this gets so frustrating because it's the same tactic that evil has used from time immemorial over and over and over again and again and again. And it's done the same thing to you now with this subject. But it is the tried and true technique of inversion. And they invert it 180 degrees, a diametrically opposed, a polar opposite to the truth concept that they want to wage war against. They take that and they just flip it on its head and sell you on that. It's the most perfectly exemplary representation of the adversarial force in nature. That force that pulls away from that which is godly and true and divine and moral and of nature. You can see this dark, insidious influence all throughout our current modern culture. You can see the elements of complete adversarial force inversion everywhere, taking what is absolutely fundamentally true and telling you that the truth lies in the complete opposite of that thing. Male and female, the essence of duality here on Earth. And so what does the adversarial force do? It says, nope, as obvious as that is, we are going to convince you that this is in fact a mistake by nature. No, male and female is just a concept that can change as arbitrarily as the fanciful imaginations of a child. This adversarial force has infected even mathematics. What could be more logically left-brained and precise than mathematics?
Today, I learned that my dislike for math was because math is actually racist. Yep, you heard that right. The California State Education Panel thinks 2 + 2 = 4 is inequitable and no longer wants to make getting the right answer the main objective of mathematics.
This is classic inversion. Health, harmony, goodness, and beauty. These are all concepts that are married together. What does the adversarial force do? Nope, that's nonsense. You can be expressing all the characteristics of disease and ugliness and decrepitude and indulgence. You can be on every single drug and pill imaginable. Your weight could be astronomical, and the world wants to tell you that that can be healthy. There's no actual objective thing called health. That's just a concept that is subject to change with culture and time. Okay? That is the adversarial force of inversion screwing up your mind. It's war against nature. It's war against God. I mean, why do you think that amongst all religion, you have to ask yourself, why is that? Sorry, I didn't mean to take off on that. It's just I'm just trying to get you to understand the spirit and essence of the enemy that you're up against. That's why, because if you understand the spiritual essence of the thing, you're so much better equipped to be able to decode what you see going on around you in the outside world. And that's the gift I'm really trying to give you guys, okay? So please, I don't go on these little tangents for no reason. It's just I'm trying to impress on you what this is really about, okay? And this starts to make so much sense. Oh my gosh, it's like it's a gift and curse to just really know why everything is happening around you the way it is. And it's important that we are all up to speed on this. Okay, so CO2 has been demonized as the enemy. We're just going to go through basic smoking gun facts about the CO2 narrative that you need to know for any time this subject comes up in debate, or just to keep in mind. This has all been done way before me, way before my time. All the individuals far more intelligent than myself have done this work for me already. I'm just kind of putting it together in a summary, and I'm just showing it to you. And then, of course, you should study on your own regardless. Okay, so let's go through some of these now. Some CO2 hoax smoking gun facts. The zero causal relationship for CO2 towards temperature. There is no causal relationship between CO2 and temperature. The narrative goes, CO2 caused by humans, caused by the industrialized human world, creates warming on planet Earth. That's the narrative, okay? So if that's the narrative, then what you would expect to see is that when more human-produced CO2 reaches the atmosphere, you would find that always that is associated with warmer temperatures on the planet. Now, the problem with that narrative is that that's never been seen. It's never been seen. That's just not... When we observe reality, that narrative doesn't hold up. So that's a problem. The 20th century data shows runaway warming from 1900 to 1940, where industrialization was not at peak levels. So in the graph over here from the Earth Observatory at NASA, okay, these are official figures here, what it's showing you is that from 1900 to 1940, there was a gradual rise, actually a pretty sharp rise in global temperatures, okay? Now, from the 1940s onward, we had what has been recorded as the post-war recovery period, and that's where industrialization really starts taking off for the rest of the century. Okay? Now, if the narrative is correct, what you would expect to find is you would expect to find a radical increase in temperatures just taking off as industrialization picks up and produces more CO2. Again, the problem is that is not what we saw in the 20th century. If CO2 production as a result of industry drives temperature change, then we would see the exact opposite of what official statistics have recorded. Temperature should not be dropping post-1940s. It should be rising as a direct result of heightened industrial activity. Okay? So first thing to remember about the CO2 myth is that the 20th century is a rebuttal to the narrative. The first half of the 20th century, we saw temperatures rising when industrialization was not yet at its peak. It was just burgeoning. Then you had the post-war recovery period where it started to get cooler. It just started to get cooler and cooler and cooler and cooler as industrialization ramped up. That's compelling fact number one about the CO2 myth, okay? We just talked about cooling, okay? So from the 1940s onward, it started to cool. So what did the media do? Well, they started rolling with the punches. And instead of convincing you that the world is going to overheat, what they did was they tried to sell you on the fact that the major calamity is going to be a global ice age. The ice is going to overtake everybody as a result of human interaction. The whole world's gonna freeze over if we don't do something immediately to combat the threat of environmental disaster. Cooling trend in Northern Hemisphere from the New York Times of January 5th. Air pollution may trigger the ice age, scientists feel, from the Telegraph of 1974. Oh, I'm pulling all of these from the Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change by Mark Morano. Fantastic book. Definitely give that a read. Geologists say winter is getting colder. All these quotes from all media outlets. Scientists agree world is colder. British climate scientist predicts new ice age. New ice age is coming from the Los Angeles Times. The ice age cometh from Canberra Times in 1975. On and on it goes. Okay? Cooling. That's the trend in the 1970s, okay? That's what they tried to sell you on. Now, of course, once we drift into the 80s, 90s, we start to drift into the global warming lie. Because now, it's like, the cooling thing that's run its course. Let's keep the fear alive, and let's just hope the public forgets that 2 seconds ago we told them that the Earth was going to freeze over. Now let's drift into, no, you know what? The world is going to overheat. It's going to be a bloody witch's cauldron. It's just, everyone's just going to boil over. So now the network of evil switches tactics to global warming. See, they realized that they didn't want to be as specific as warming or cooling. So what did they do? They just called it climate change, because climate change encompasses virtually, by definition, anything that happens in the atmosphere, period. Anything that has to do with weather that changes is now an enemy. Genius. And they do this just on a whim, on a dime, and they hope that you'll just forget that they were so callous with their propaganda. So childish. Let's talk about the greenhouse effect. Something that all school children are just drubbed over the head with, propagandized with the greenhouse effect, the greenhouse effect, the greenhouse effect. Let's talk about greenhouse gases. The Earth is not like a greenhouse, but the analogy is used to oversimplify the phenomenon of temperature on the Earth. And what's interesting about the greenhouse effect angle is probably the most obvious, right? The Earth is not a bloody greenhouse. That should be pretty clear, right? We know what a greenhouse looks like, okay? We've seen a greenhouse encased in a glass structure. We know that that's what a greenhouse looks like. And if you look outside in any natural setting, you'll notice that there's no glass dome, there's no glass covering that encapsulates any wide area of the atmosphere. It's open air. And so effectively that would mean to common sense that the Earth is not at all a greenhouse, because it's not. There's no bloody greenhouse, right? So there's that, I guess. A greenhouse allows shortwave radiation in, which is reflected by surfaces as longwave radiation, which is trapped from escaping via the glass. Okay? So you can see that in the diagram over here that I've got of how the greenhouse effect works. But this is not how the Earth's atmosphere works. Evaporation, wind transfers of heat, condensation, etc., create a complex set of variables that contribute to climate fluctuations. So that's the second case about this CO2 myth and the global warming thing that you have to know about. When people bring this up, an easy answer would be like, oh, well, good thing the Earth's not a greenhouse. I don't know. And over here in the bottom, you can see, this is an excerpt from Human-Caused Global Warming by Tim Ball. Rest in peace, Tim Ball. Unbelievable man, whose work will immortalize him as a true light worker. He's done some amazing stuff. And you need to read that book as well. And this is just a little diagram of a greenhouse on the left there. And on the right, how the Earth works, right? Yeah, you could call it something like a greenhouse, but it's not. Right? Because there are variables at play in the Earth's atmosphere that are simply not at work in a greenhouse. And so these two are fundamentally, they're different. Okay, let's keep exploring the greenhouse thing. So there are three main gases that make up the greenhouse gases. Okay? When we talk about the greenhouse effect, we're talking about three main types of greenhouse elements, three greenhouse gases. Those gases are, number one, water vapor. Number two, CO2. And number three, methane. Okay? There are others, but they make up just such a small percentage that we don't really need to get into them. Now, here's the thing. Greenhouse gases, okay, all of the greenhouse gases combined comprise only about 2% of the entire atmosphere, okay? So all greenhouse gases comprise only about 2% of the atmosphere. Of that 2%, and you can follow along with this, with that diagram here on the bottom, where we got those two kind of blue, well, one's a blue square, another's a blue rectangle made up of squares. And you can see in the top right of that first rectangle, that's the whole rectangle is the entire atmosphere. And just the square at the top right, that represents all of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So only 2% of the atmosphere is composed of greenhouse gases. Now, of that 2%, only 4% of those greenhouse gases are CO2, right? So now if we take a look at that square in the top right corner of the entire atmosphere rectangle, okay, just that top portion, if we extrude that out, only the top portion of that tiny little square would be composed of CO2. So the vast majority of the greenhouse gases is made up of water vapor. So that's 95%, give or take, of greenhouse gases that are made up of water vapor. Now, it gets more interesting though. Of that 4%, that is CO2, okay? Of that 4%, see in the top right, you have the yellow portion, okay? That yellow portion of the square now, that's CO2. So it's only 4% of all of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, mostly water, okay? Of all of the CO2, only 4% of that could possibly be attributed to anthropogenic causes. People don't know this. And if you don't, you're going to be very easily swayed and manipulated by straight outright lies. Okay, so if you look at this graph here on the top, right, where that big blue circle is that says carbon dioxide, the graph with the X through it, this is a typical media portrayal of CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, so this is how the media would represent how much CO2 is in the atmosphere if they're trying to sell you on the whole climate change nonsense, okay? Again, this is all coming from the book Human-Caused Global Warming by Tim Ball. Fantastic book. That is how the media would portray CO2 in the atmosphere. And in the bottom, where I have the check mark, this is what a more appropriate, actually realistic portrayal of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere would really look like, okay? It would look like all water vapor and a tiny fraction being CO2, okay? Of the CO2 that's man-made, you can't even see it, right? It's just so insignificant. What's very interesting about this is this. If the narrative is correct and the greenhouse effect is something that we need to worry about, okay? What you would have to ask then is why did they not target water as the enemy to be waged war on? This is very problematic because if we're trying to mitigate against the greenhouse effect, then it would make sense to go after the greenhouse gas that makes up the greatest proportion of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So you would target water. Well, water would be the new enemy. Now, of course, to convince you that water is bad for you and is bad for the atmosphere, oh, no, that would be a stretch. No, people would be too smart for that, right? So instead, what we'll do is we'll just convince you that CO2 is the bad guy. And that's much more believable, right? No, it's not more believable. It's just as ridiculous. We're carbon-based beings. Okay. Anyway, that's another one that you need to keep fresh in your mind when this subject comes up in your circle of friends and wherever, to keep there so you can bring some clarity to the debate when people go off spouting the climate change nonsense. Oh, by the way, I should say, I say climate change nonsense. I know I have to be careful. I know no matter what is said here, sometimes when you're doing a presentation or whatnot, sometimes it's hard to cover all your bases, and you get excited and you say things that could be more fleshed out or more detailed. So I know I'm going to miss things and details here or there, right? So for whatever those are, please accept my apologies. When I say climate change nonsense, okay, I don't mean to suggest that climate does not change. Okay, that might have been obvious, but I'm just to put it out there. Climate does in fact change, just like everything in the physical world. Okay, there's nothing that is not subject to the law of change. Climate changes. It's just, as we'll see, it has nothing to do with human-caused CO2. Okay, or human activity on the planet, period. We'll get into this later, but pollution is a real problem, yes, okay? And pollution has its own whole set of issues that become things that are worth considering. But it's not that climate change is caused by these things, okay? In any significant way. So let's just continue, and this will probably get cleared up. The next time that someone tells you that we must all reduce our carbon footprint in order to save the planet from climate change, be sure to remind that person that carbon dioxide, CO2, is the elixir of life. Without CO2, all plant life would die, which means all humans and animals would also die. CO2 is plant food, after all, facilitating photosynthesis and the life cycle itself. That's from Natural News. Also from Natural News, removing CO2 from the planet like the climate cultists are demanding would render the entire world barren of life. It would quickly become a wasteland marked with death and destruction, and would certainly not be a paradise. For the past several years, the corporate-controlled media, leftist politicians, and members of the Church of Global Warming have been telling us that CO2 is a pollutant. Nothing could be further from the truth. Related CO2 has absolutely nothing to do with global temperatures. That's from Natural News. This is from an article called Carbon Dioxide Isn't a Pollutant Causing Global Warming. It's the elixir of life. Okay, so you can take a look at the article yourself. Pretty good article. Scientific American says that CO2 is a fertilizer that keeps forests and natures vibrant. Ironically enough, CO2 is also responsible for keeping the planet green, as in rich and lush with trees, fauna, and other plant life. Without CO2, the entire planet would be brown and barren. For all of their talk about embracing a green agenda, the greenies are fighting against the very thing that actually keeps the planet green in color. Talk about insanity. So, again, this is another CO2 hoax smoking gun fact. When people bring up the whole CO2 thing, reducing CO2 in the atmosphere, and we'll get to a lot more here, but so just bear with me. But the first thing to point out is that, hey, by the way, you'd be dead if it weren't for CO2, right? Just easy. It's the elixir of life. What really causes global warming? This is Philip Stott in It's All Unraveling Global Warming Politics in 2008. As I have said over and over again, the fundamental point has always been this. Climate change is governed by hundreds of factors or variables, and the very idea that we can manage climate change predictably by understanding and manipulating at the margins one politically selected factor, CO2, is as misguided as it gets. What really causes global warming? As you can see here on the slide, it's the obvious causes. The atmosphere, the oceans, and the sun. My goodness, the sun. I mean, who could have imagined that the sun would have anything to do with the long-term climate fluctuations on planet Earth? Could you imagine something more audacious? Okay, with the atmosphere, we've got wind transfer of heat horizontally through the troposphere, right? So unlike what happens in a greenhouse, the horizontal movement of atmosphere all around the planet, and that atmosphere being influenced by all the other things in the atmosphere, like oceans and whatnot, topography, ice or lack of ice, depth of the ocean, depth of riverbeds and other bodies of water, presence of trees, lack of trees, etc., etc. All of those variables are influencing the atmosphere, and then that atmosphere shifts and moves along the whole plane of the Earth because it's the open air. It's not a greenhouse. So there's that. The oceans act as a major reservoir of CO2. When the ocean temperatures heat up, they emit CO2. And when they are cooled, they suck in CO2. So the oceans are the main reservoir of CO2, right? That is very important to know about demonizing CO2 as a cause for climate change, right? And then, of course, you have the sun. The natural ebbs and flows of grand solar cycles obviously going to be much more influential on the heat dynamics of this planet than anything that we could do here as human beings on the planet. Our influence is so marginal compared to the massive burning ball of divine energy that just beautifully and radiantly bathes us in these light rays every single day. I mean, of course, you know what's interesting? This is just my mind working and just kind of having fun with this, but if you've ever been outside on a day where it was sunny, but the sun was just being blocked by the clouds and there's a little bit of wind, okay, you can go from being fairly chilly and in seconds, as soon as the sun peeks through some clouds, you can be experiencing comfortable warm temperature. And then the next second after that, the cloud covers up the sun again, and now you're instantly chilly. Really warm to really cold. In seconds. I've been to a lot of parties in my day with rooms full of people. I have never, ever experienced becoming radically warmer or radically colder depending on how many people were in the room with me breathing out CO2. But that's just me rambling. Let's go on to the real stuff. Okay, so when we're talking about the sun, what really causes global warming? People have known for 200 years that there's some link between sunspots and our climate. In 1800, the astronomer William Herschel, he didn't need a climate model. He didn't even have a calculator. Yet he could see that the wheat prices rose and fell in time with the sunspot cycle. Since then, people have noticed that rainfall patterns are also linked to sunspots. This is from the paper Global Bullies Want Your Money. Definitely worth a read. Sunspots themselves don't make much difference to us, but they are a sign of how weak or strong the sun's magnetic field is. This massive solar magnetic field reaches out around the Earth and it shields us from cosmic rays. Now, this correlation between cosmic rays and temperature is much better over all spans of time than that with carbon and temperature. Okay, so over here on the left side of the screen, you can see a diagram where we've got weak solar magnetic field, right? Characterized by fewer sunspots on the sun. And you can see, the thing is you can see these sunspots with a proper magnification. And so it's good in being able to kind of determine what likely temperature variations are going to be depending on sunspot activity or lack of. So you see that the weak magnetic field, right, with no sunspot activity is not stopping the cosmic rays from hitting the Earth. And when those cosmic rays penetrate through the atmosphere, then you'll get a cooler Earth. Whereas when there's a strong magnetic field, and when that happens, you have this sunspot activity, then the strong magnetic field blocks the cosmic rays from hitting the Earth, and this results in clearer skies and a warmer Earth. So this is the Svensmark cosmic ray theory, where a stronger solar magnetic field means fewer cosmic rays and fewer clouds on Earth. Okay? From human-caused global warming, once again, Tim Ball goes on about the Milankovitch cycles. The IPCC models do not include what is called the Milankovitch effect, named after the 19th century Serbian mathematician Milutin Milankovic. These variations in the three major Sun-Earth relationships that change the net amount of energy reaching the Earth every single year, which changes global temperature. We've known about these changes for over 130 years. There's only a tiny diagram here, I know, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I'll just basically say that there are grand cosmic cycles that take into consideration relationships that the sun has with the Earth and the moon, okay, that influence temperature over much longer periods of time.
Of the three major orbital cycles, precession, obliquity, and ellipticity, reinforced or canceled one another. In 1920, Kirpin collaborated with Serbian mathematician Milutin Milankovic to make precise mathematical calculations of the combined effect of the three cycles. Today, these results suggest a 10,000-year cycle of glaciation.
Please remember, ladies and gentlemen, the sun is an organism, okay? It's a living thing. It's an entity. And just like all living things, it is subject to its own cycles. Just like you have a day-night cycle, a wakeful and restful cycle, just like we have menstrual cycles, hormonal cycles, we have all these different types of cycles that characterize life. And when it comes to the celestial cycles, some of these cycles are just so grand and protracted over vast swaths of time that they're harder for us to immediately recognize, at least in the short term. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist, okay? So these cycles are going to be far more influential than anything you do on Earth as a human being with human industry, right? These are nothing compared to the natural rhythmical cycles that a sun or a planet would go through as a function of being alive, okay? As a function of taking part in the life game. It's just that these are grand bodies and we are smaller bodies, smaller cycles. So that means when your vegan friends out there are going off about how we need to save the planet's temperature by going vegan, then we just remind them that, hey, by the way, there are no climate change cows, okay? We have to understand that just because we know and understand that animal exploitation and animal domination and animal slavery and torture is absolutely fundamentally wrong, it does not mean that that causes climate change, and it doesn't mean that we should blame climate change on animal exploitation. It's wrong and problematic for many reasons, but climate change is not one of them. So we have to be mature and responsible and grow up out of this mindset, right? This mindset that the world is forcing you, is desperate for you to accept and understand so that they can manipulate the hell out of your life and your children's lives and plummet us into a very bleak future, all right? We don't even want to go down that road. Let's cover some more smoking gun CO2 facts. Okay, so we're still on temperature changes throughout history, independent of man-made CO2. This is a major one, okay? When the IPCC, I didn't mention it earlier. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a UN-created organization. And when the IPCC was preparing its data to present at UN conferences about the dangers of climate change, this data had to be ignored, for it would destroy the entire theory of man-made warming. So everyone should know about this subject, okay? This has to be common knowledge as the propaganda for this intensifies. So the medieval warm period from 1000 AD to 1400 AD. The medieval warm period is characterized by a paradisical temperature and stories of verdure and splendor and riches and plenty. It's the age of cathedral builders in Europe, where the temperature was good and clement and produced abundant crops. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful time, temperature-wise at least. So over here on the left-hand side, you see a little chart with temperature on the y-axis and then years before present on the x. And with ice core data, okay, water does a very good job of preserving a memory of past temperatures when it's frozen. And we've been able to use an examination of ice core data to be able to determine pretty well what temperatures were like back in history. Here's a little blurb from Geological Evidence of Recurring Climate Cycles and Their Implications for the Cause of Global Climate Changes. The past is the key to the future. The medieval warm period was a time of warm climate from about 900 to 1300 AD, when global temperatures were somewhat warmer than at present. Temperatures in the GISP, so a particular ice core sample, temperatures in the GISP2 ice core were about 2 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than modern temperatures. The effects of the warm period were particularly evident in Europe, where grain crops flourished, alpine tree lines rose, many new cities arose, and the population more than doubled. Now, why did the IPCC have to hide this data from UN conferences and climate conferences? Because it obviously shows that temperatures in the medieval warm period were higher than temperatures are today in the modern world, where we have this industrial man-made process that is supposed to be heating the world to unprecedented levels of temperature. So that entire narrative completely disintegrates and falls apart when we simply look into history and notice that temperatures were higher in our past, and you can't attribute it to human-caused CO2. The whole narrative must fall apart.
This warming period that we're in now, the modern warming period, or modern warm period, began around 1600 AD. The medieval warm period was around 1000 AD. From then it cooled into the Little Ice Age, 1600 AD. That's 423 years ago, more than 4 centuries. That's when it started warming again. We didn't start using fossil fuels to any extent until 150 years after that. And since then, the warming has continued at pretty much exactly the same pace that it did from 1600 till about 1850, 250 years. It hasn't changed in the slightest in terms of its upward slope. And in fact, about 150 years from now, we should expect the modern warm period to reverse itself again and go back into a cooling period, as it has 3 times in cycles since the Minoan warm period, which was 3,000 years ago.
But of course, it doesn't end there. There's the Little Ice Age from 1300 AD to the late 1800s AD, where temperatures fell dramatically. These were unspeakably challenging winters during this time. And during this time, people unfortunately were stricken with miserable and very, very challenging winters. This was not a period of time. If you were living in Europe, this was really, really rough. Okay? Thank God we're not living through the Little Ice Age right now. So, we have both ends of the spectrum. We have rampant warming and we have outrageous cooling, and all done without any of the influence of a profound human industry pumping CO2 in the atmosphere. So what does that tell us? It tells us pretty convincingly that human-produced CO2 can't really be part of the equation when it comes to temperature on planet Earth. Everyone needs to know about the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age, okay? Okay, but it doesn't end there. Throughout most of the history on Earth, temperatures have been warmer than present averages. We have what we have identified now as the Holocene period. The Holocene period is an era spanning from approximately 11,000, not 100, 11,000 years ago until now. That is what we've classified as the Holocene period. Now, within the Holocene period, we have what has been identified as the Holocene maximum, a very prolonged period during the Bronze Age that spanned 3 millennia, where temperatures were far warmer than anything we have today. So we're talking about deep now in human history, where temperatures were exceeding anything like the temperatures we have today in this industrialized contemporary time. On the left here, it says this graph compares temperature and atmospheric CO2, but loses much of the detail of the previous graph. The scale expands dramatically from 420,000 years ago, which is 0.007% of the total, to 600 million years ago. And you can see over here in the chart, again, from Human-Caused Global Warming by Tim Ball, you can see that through 600 million years of records, that approximately hundreds of millions of years ago, we've recorded all sorts of atmospheric CO2 and temperature, and none of it can be attributed to human causes whatsoever. Okay, so at this point, we should start to be getting really comfortable with the idea that this CO2 thing is just utter nonsense. Let's go on though. This is from The Broken Greenhouse, Why CO2 is a Minor Player in Global Climate. The greenhouse hypothesis of global warming is not supported by physical evidence. Alright, just straight up. The global push for renewable energy generation of electricity is based on the false premise that we need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to forestall dangerous warming. How much warming is dangerous? The IPCC says 2 degrees is dangerous. Okay. So the narrative, all right, the official narrative is that if the temperature rises by 2 degrees, that's very dangerous, okay? But here's the problem. Continuing on, they are ignoring the Cretaceous period when global temperatures were at least 10 degrees warmer, and the Paleocene-Eocene when temperatures were up to 19 degrees warmer. The IPCC's arbitrary 2 degrees, quote-unquote, tipping point has no basis in science. In fact, during the last 10,000 years, the temperature has cycled several times through warm and cool periods of 2 degrees or more. We've got a couple more from this paper, from this same paper. And this is good. I'd like to go over this with you guys. The major greenhouse gas is water vapor, which absorbs almost all wavelengths of infrared radiation. Carbon dioxide absorbs 4 specific wavelengths. Okay, I'd like to go over these because, all right, here, okay, this is also pretty important because, again, the narrative is that if there's more CO2 pumped into the atmosphere, then this will constitute a problem, okay? But what turns out to be the case is that CO2 becomes exponentially more and more irrelevant the more you pump into the atmosphere, because there's a threshold where more doesn't equate to more effect in temperature. And, well, okay, so let's go through this. The major greenhouse gas is water vapor, which absorbs almost all wavelengths of infrared radiation. Carbon dioxide absorbs 4 specific wavelengths of infrared radiation, 3 of which are also absorbed by water vapor. Other minor greenhouse gases are oxygen and ozone and methane and nitrous oxide. Once a particular wavelength becomes, okay, listen to this. Once a particular wavelength becomes saturated, i.e., almost completely absorbed, additional quantities of greenhouse gases have no effect. Carbon dioxide is currently about 400 parts per million, 0.04% of the atmosphere. Yet this nearly negligible amount is touted as the main driver of global temperature, kind of like what we talked about before. Notice that even at the highest sensitivity on the chart, doubling CO2, carbon dioxide, from 400 parts per million to 800 parts per million results in a theoretical rise in temperature of only slightly more than 1 degree. Nothing to worry about. The climate system consists of two turbulent fluids, the atmosphere and the oceans, interacting with one another. As the IPCC rightly says in its third assessment report, in climate research and modeling, we should recognize that we are dealing with a coupled, non-linear, chaotic system, and therefore that the prediction of a specific future climate state is not possible. That's actually from the IPCC. That's very surprising. Okay, continuing on, because this point is important, and I'd rather just read exactly what they have here, because I probably couldn't do a better job. This logarithmic formula produces a graph in the form shown below. This shows that as the concentration of carbon dioxide increases, it has less and less influence. This graph is the pure theoretical capacity of carbon dioxide to warm the atmosphere in the absence of any confounding feedbacks. The different curves represent different values of sensitivity. So carbon dioxide is currently about 400 parts per million, as we said before, of the atmosphere. Yet this nearly negligible amount is touted as the main driver of global temperature. Notice that even at the highest sensitivity on the chart, doubling carbon dioxide from 400 parts per million to 800 parts per million results in a theoretical rise in temperature of only slightly more than 1 degree Celsius. Nothing to worry about. So that, I would submit, is again, it's a very good piece of data to keep in your mind. You don't need to memorize graphs or charts or whatnot. Just understand the concept of a threshold, right? An atmospheric threshold where more CO2 does not result in more and more and more temperature rising because it just drops off at a certain level. It's like if you're trying to blot out the sun from your room by painting the windows black. One coat of black paint will do the job. Another coat and another coat and another coat, it starts to be irrelevant. You're blocking all the sun possible, and more coats of paint don't do anything. That's what it's like with CO2 and temperature. Okay, the relationship, who cares after a certain level? This is from Zbigniew Jaworowski. All right, from the CO2 is the greatest scandal of our time. Anthropogenic warming that isn't. The second most important message of the summary for policymakers of 2007 is that most of the observed increase in globally average temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse concentrations. Neither the summary for policymakers document nor the 3 former IPCC reports supported this statement with any convincing scientific evidence. The infamous temperature hockey stick curve, the leading symbol of the IPCC report in 2001, was created to show that the global average temperatures in the 1990s was unusual and the highest in the last 1,000 years. The medieval warming, the years of 950 to 1300, were well documented in the former IPCC reports, disappeared from this hockey stick curve, as did the earlier Roman warm period from 200 BC to 600 AD, another warm period that I didn't really touch on. The Holocene warm period from 8,000 to 5,000 years before present, and the deep cooling of the Little Ice Age from 1350 to 1850. Okay? So this is just kind of recapitulating what we introduced earlier. Just to settle in your mind that temperatures have risen and fallen, CO2 concentrations have risen and fallen all throughout history, up and down, just going nuts all over the place. Had nothing to do with human beings, had nothing to do with human-caused CO2, none of it. okay? And most all that data, they have to hide from the public or from these climate conferences, but we'll get to that in just a second.
At the center of the controversy was the so-called hockey stick, a graph of supposed global temperature over the past centuries, showing a dramatic increase in average temperature over the last century or so. Its inventor, Michael Mann, of Penn State University, was vaulted to climate stardom when he first presented it in the late 90s. It was the visual basis of much of the warming hysteria, including bogus reports from the IPCC. Ultimately, in addition to Mann's claim for the dramatic recent uptick, which we were supposed to believe was the result of the late Industrial Revolution and dramatic increase in the burning of fossil fuels, Keith Briffa, of the CIU at the University of East Anglia in England declared, based on Eurasian data, that the well-documented medieval warm period, from around 950 to 1250 AD, didn't actually exist. Interestingly, in Mann's thesis, his initial formulation only went back to 1400 AD, the beginning of the so-called Little Ice Age. Adding the earlier medieval warm period would have resulted in having a two-bladed hockey stick. It was found that Mann's methodology would generate a hockey stick almost independently of the data input. The climate scientists withheld data that would help to resolve the controversy, despite numerous freedom of information requests.
This chart is just the same thing. There's, in the article, I tried to find a clearer image for this graph here from the article, The Greatest Scientific Scandal of Our Time, but I couldn't find a clearer one, so I know you can't really see it properly here, so I apologize for that. But all it is just a CO2 concentration over time, and it's just showing that there's just all sorts of variability. Okay, this one is actually kind of funny. The existence of conventional crop growing in greenhouses, the standard protocol seems to debunk the theory of the danger of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? I find this hilarious. Go look up how CO2 concentrations affect a greenhouse, okay? And you'll find that dramatically increasing the amount of CO2 in concentrations that are far in excess of what is atmospherically normal right now results in splendor for the plants that you're trying to grow. A paradisical green garden. This is from an article, CO2 calculator for grow room or indoor greenhouse. And it goes on, grow room and indoor greenhouse growers online agree that for optimum plant growth, you should enrich the air around the plants with CO2 during the daylight growth cycle. Photosynthesis, plant growth, requires light, nutrients, water, and CO2. Okay. Nothing we don't know, really. If you give your plants the perfect amount of light, water, and nutrients, the limiting factor in their growth will be the amount of CO2 in the air. While normal outdoor CO2 levels, about 400 parts per million, okay, will achieve normal plant growth, doubling or tripling the CO2 levels can increase the growth rate. However, above 2,000 parts per million of CO2 becomes toxic to plants. Okay. And above 5,000 CO2 becomes potentially harmful to people. Most experts agree that 1,500 parts per million is the maximum CO2 level for maximum plant growth. Although any CO2 levels between 1,000 parts per million and 1,500 parts per million will produce greatly improved results. So basically, if we want to have a green growing, fruit abundant, nut abundant world, if we wanted to have that world, then what we would want is we would want to ultra concentrate the atmosphere with CO2. Are we getting this? We would want to ultra concentrate the atmosphere for insane and optimum plant growth that are not at concentrations that would detrimentally affect human beings. So yeah, it starts to be weird when we already have established greenhouse protocols that result in beautiful growth of plants, where we come up with this narrative that CO2 is the bad guy. It has that flavor of that insidious inversion thing that is just like, what? Okay, in a nutshell, what has happened is that we've identified a whole range of human-sourced offenses to the planet's functioning. Pollution, all right? We've identified those, and there's that. And so what's happened is we've simply taken CO2 and we've lumped it under the same umbrella, and evil is hoping that you accept the whole thing without noticing, hey, hold on. Yeah, I agree that soil contamination, I agree that ocean garbage and toxic chemical waste and plastics and chemtrails, yeah, I agree with all of these things as being pollutants that we should do something about. I see that you lumped in CO2. That couldn't be more natural, right? So they've done that and they're hoping that you don't notice. But the thing is, when we're talking about human-caused CO2, what are we talking about? We're talking about breathing. If you read between the lines, what it means is that they're going to start coming after your family, print you out some sort of scientific report on how much CO2 an extra kid will generate. So now they have license to do all that, right? Because CO2 is a part of life. All they've done is they've lumped CO2 in with all the other things that we accept as bad and hope that you swallow the whole thing and not notice that you just bought a lie. That's essentially it. The whole polar bear thing, they really stopped talking about that because it started to become embarrassing because the facts just didn't square up to the reality of what we observed. So we don't hear as much about that anymore. But the thing is, you have to know that this is the kind of stuff that they tried to do. So you can't forget about these things. You can't forget, hey, you guys used these tactics to mess my mind up earlier. You can't trust the world. You can't trust them. So they tried to convince you that polar bears dying was a result of you, right? You breathing on the planet. This is from global warming scare campaigns no longer use polar bears as props because polar bears are thriving. Global warming theory first became popularized when science publishers began to circulate pictures of polar bears dying in Arctic waters, surrounded by melting icebergs. This visual of dying polar bears was etched in the public consciousness for years, driving climate activism, scientific funding, and political agendas. This wouldn't be the first time that human empathy for animals would be used to manipulate public opinion and achieve political goals. While scientists widely acknowledge that shrinking Arctic ice poses a significant threat to these iconic creatures, the reality is that they are not dying off in record numbers and are even thriving during the summer, when the ice caps are at their lowest level. In 2017 and 2018, National Geographic overhyped the lie that polar bears were starving and dying off in record numbers. It turns out that polar bear populations in the Chukchi Sea have thrived in the summer months when ice levels are at significant lows. It turns out that polar bears don't even need ice to survive year-round. Here's another article. New evidence suggests polar bears survived just fine during 1,600 years of warm, ice-free summers. New research published in the Nature journal suggested that for at least 1,600 years of Earth's history, the polar ice caps melted every single summer, and the polar bears that lived in these areas survived just fine despite all that seasonal warming. It turns out that summer is when conditions are warmer, meaning ice melts, only to refreeze in the winter. These are called seasons. A concept that climate change fanatics apparently never learned in school because perhaps their teachers were too busy trying to convince them to switch genders. And here's the last element that we need to get into that you have to absolutely fundamentally know to know that this entire thing is just a scam and it's psychological warfare. The ClimateGate scandal. This has to be common knowledge. We can't let this drift into oblivion. The 1990s saw a massive surge in global warming, brainwashing, and alarmism. The corruption of climate science was spearheaded by the Climate Research Unit of the University of East Anglia. The Conference of Parties, the COP, was a political consolidation created by Maurice Strong to implement bogus climate science coming out of the IPCC. Now, eventually, the hysteria led to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1997, which was a conference that was intended to punish developing nations for producing CO2. Okay, so the 1990s roll around, and the international community wants to really scare populations into believing the global warming lie. So by 97, after years of propagandizing the public, they want to hold this conference and formalize their stance and create new legislation moving forward. Okay? Legislation that will cripple development and cripple industrialized progress. All right, in reverence and worship of the climate change gods. Okay, so in 1997, then we had the Kyoto Protocols. Okay, and the Kyoto Protocols were designed to punish developing nations for producing CO2. Okay, so that's the conference that we're talking about in 1997. So now moving on from 1997, due to healthy skepticism of other professionals in the field, and to the bogus science, the Kyoto Protocols were in political trouble. People weren't believing the lie. So in an attempt to rescue the global warming hysteria narrative, the Copenhagen 2009 conference was arranged for to combat the distrust of the public. Okay, you following? But right before the conference in 2009, over 1,000 leaked emails from the University of East Anglia's CRU, Climate Research Unit, were released, which revealed clear and obvious foul play, data manipulation, data deletion, obfuscation of evidence, formula tweaking, and other such deception to further the lie of man-made climate change and hide the truth that anthropogenic global warming is a bold-faced lie. So from the article, The Green is the New Red, it heads up by saying the ClimateGate scandal tore off the fraudulent facade of man-made global warming theory. Wow. The ClimateGate scandal, and again, the scandal is the leaked emails of the CRU workers at University of East Anglia, and the emails revealed that they were communicating and collaborating with one another with how to basically deceive and delete data to convince the world that the lie is real. The ClimateGate cheating scandal exposed the man-made global warming theory for what it is. The most brazen scientific hoax in human history, an international collusion to destroy capitalism in the world's largest capitalist nation, to pave the way for that nation's sovereignty being handed over to a global governing authority run by the United Nations. Oof. That is a serious charge on my part, so please allow me to justify it by citing the words of two high-profile UN climate officials in the thick of the effort to strip away America's sovereignty. Christiana Figueres served as the executive secretary of the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change, and in a frank admission that laid bare the stealth agenda behind climate alarmism, Figueres said during a February 2015 press conference in Brussels that the UN's real purpose in promoting climate fear, listen to this, the real purpose is to kill off capitalism throughout the world. The real purpose is to kill off capitalism? So this is just a political thing, right? Who could have known? This is the first time in human history that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally changing or getting rid of the economic development model that has reigned since the Industrial Revolution. Now, I'm not going to read through all of these, but this is from ClimateGate, A Failure of Governance. You definitely want to check this one out. This is just a summary of some of the emails that were leaked in the ClimateGate scandal. From Phil Jones, I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding in real temperatures to each series for the last 20 years, and from 1961 for Keith's to hide the decline. Hide the decline. They're talking about data manipulation. How do we hide the decline from other climatologists who are going to be scrutinizing our data? From Phil Jones again, if they ever hear there is a Freedom of Information Act now in the UK, I think I'll delete the file rather than send to anyone. The scientific community would come down on me in no uncertain terms if I said the world had cooled from 1998. Okay, it has. But it is only 7 years of data and it isn't statistically significant. As you know, I'm not political. If anything, I would like to see climate change. I would like to see climate change happen so the science could be proved right, regardless of the consequences. This isn't being political, it is being selfish. You can read the rest of these if you want, but again, it just really makes it very clear and obvious that the world's taking you for a ride, right? Here's the problem. A year later, another treasure trove of leaked emails surfaced corroborating the insidious nature of the IPCC, COP, CRU, and the ClimateGate scandal of 2009. It doesn't end there. In 2015 now, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, In an attempt to impress the Paris 2015 climate congregations, after years of being disgraced by public opinion regarding global warming, devised a flagrantly unscientific report to fill a bill. So here's the problem. From 1997 to 2017, there had been no significant increase in temperatures. Now, this failure of Mother Nature to comply with despicable socialist, Marxist, eugenicist, collectivist, social engineering, political agendas, this is obviously in my wording, was deeply embarrassing and had to be fixed before the public caught on to the great lie. So what you had then was ClimateGate 2, another scandal. You can read this blurb if you like, but essentially, no warming from 1997 to 2017, the great global warming pause, or the warming hiatus. This is a huge problem. This is a huge problem for the narrative. Temperatures are not increasing, yet population's growing, more CO2, but there's no warming to speak of for many, many, many years. So this was a problem. So the ClimateGate scandal 2 now is where NOAA, the NOAA, they basically tried to hide this. And thanks to a whistleblower, John Bates, who was a high-ranking ex-NOAA employee, became an outspoken whistleblower on the NOAA and their flagrant data manipulation in order to push a political narrative. So basically, we've got this desperate attempt by the international community to have you believe this global warming lie. They'll do anything. They'll do anything. It's frustrating that it's actually friggin' working. That's what kills me. Okay, there should be no question about this now, at this point, all right? No question that this is a complete fabrication and it is a lie. Now, of course, how does this tie into veganism now? Now, the thing is, at this point, we should have gone through this slowly and methodically enough that you can probably just on your own read between the lines or just take what we've presented here, and you can probably start to see why it would be advantageous for these people to latch onto veganism and use that to promote this environmental thing, right? You can see how that would work. Because with environmentalism, we're setting up this kind of earth worship thing, this kind of Gaia worship thing, taking care of the planet, which is a good thing to do. But the thing is that the particular flavor that the international community takes on that, it doesn't take us down the right road. And so by ensnaring the vegan movement into that, you're going to be accessing people who already have a certain type of moral character where they want to take care of the planet. They want to take care of their surroundings. And so it would be just easier to manipulate that group to the type of environmentalism that the international community wants everyone to believe. But of course, we'll have to save that for the next one. So for now, thank you so much for sitting with me on this one. This is really important and I'm really happy to get this out so that people can learn and really, really see through this whole deception. I'm quite disappointed with how many wonderful influencers, vegan influencers, plant-based influencers are so taken by this propaganda that it's because they do such fantastic work in every other field that it garners a trust in them. And it's a well-deserved trust. But then once they start getting into the climate change propaganda, they rope in the plant-based ideology, and it's just like, no, hold on. We need to know certain things about the reality that we're living in here. Otherwise, we're going to be fighting for our own enslavement down the road. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Please subscribe to this channel if you like videos like this. And in the next episode in the series, we'll explore this subject further in terms of the connection now between veganism and environmentalism. Now that we have fleshed out all the context prior to, that is going to make that link up much easier to understand now. Okay? Thank you so much, everyone. I love you very much. I appreciate your time, and we'll see you on the next one. Stay strong, stay disciplined, stay healthy, and God bless.